Greetings, everyone. My name is Genovesi. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Logic, Cognition, Language, and Information at the University of Basque Country. Now I'm a cognitive scientist by formation with specialization in philosophy of language, mostly issues at the semantics pragmatics interface. And specifically, I work on figurative language, figurative uses of language. And so today I'm doing a little bit of research that's sort of unrelated to what I'm normally interested in looking at, but nevertheless forms a sort of hobby of mine. And that is trying to understand the philosophy of Paul Ricoeur. So Ricoeur was the reason I was interested in metaphor in the first place, and then after a few years of racking my brain over what he was talking about in terms of the power of metaphor, I abandoned that for more analytic pursuits. So today what I'm going to try and do is just spitball with you some half-baked ideas I've had about what Paul Ricoeur is attempting to say in terms of his theory of metaphor. So how I'm going to do that exactly is I'm going to try and use John Searle's terminology that we find in a number of his works on social ontology as a sort of template for interpreting what Ricoeur has to say about metaphor. Now, when Ricoeur's talking about metaphor, what he basically means is a specific kind, what he calls living metaphor. And I'll explain that, what that means in a second. We'll qualify that. And the sort of power that metaphor has over us, this poetic power to transform our world in some relevant, significant way, is produced or the result of a sort of what he calls a hermeneutic or interpretive arc, which is founded on the structure or the function of mimesis, which he gets from Aristotle. And so there are a number of claims that he makes that are quite interesting, but very difficult to understand. And so I think that using some elements from Searle's social ontology gives us a better understanding of just what exactly it is that Ricoeur is talking about. So to begin, we start with some qualifications. When I'm discussing metaphor, I might not always say living metaphor, but we should keep that in mind. And what we mean by living metaphor, what Ricoeur means by living metaphor, in fact, is something that is a metaphor that endures. So here we have reinterpretations of Shakespearean metaphors. One of the most perhaps famous examples in the literature, Juliet is the sun. So this is sort of, this can be identified as a living metaphor insofar as, we still have discussions about it in English circles and in literature circles. That the meaning has this sort of enduring vitality to it, that it allows us to sort of reinterpret it over time. And so because of that, it resists conventionalization, resists idiomatization as well. So by living metaphor, we are going to contrast it with something like idiomatic expressions. So like he kicked the bucket, for instance, which is a dead metaphor. And we're going to contrast it with conventionalized metaphors like my lawyer is a shark or John plowed through the board meeting, where we don't really see the power or vitality of the metaphor anymore. So some of the metaphors that we'll have in mind as we go along are the one by Keats, for instance, oh, for a draught of vintage, tasting of dance, Provençal, song, and sunburnt mirth. Juliet is the sun, and then another, the singing masons, building roofs of gold. So one of the prime differences between living metaphor and those two other sorts of tropes I've discussed, conventionalized metaphor and idioms, is that they most explicitly ask us for interpretation. in a way that we don't necessarily do with those two other kinds. And it's for this reason that Ricoeur finds himself quite interested in living metaphors, especially those ones that we newly coin. And it's because that they force us to think, and they present a new idea in a novel way. So here we have Keats, who was thinking that people, perhaps, drinking at a country dance. We see this group of people in our mind's eye at a country dance, and we see songs accompanying this wine drinking in Provence. And where there's wine and song, we find laughing, sunburnt faces. And he wanted his draught of wine to conjure up all these things for him in a vivid and very earthy way. Now, in the second one, which has been discussed in the literature quite a bit, we see Romeo's world as being imbued, Romeo's understanding of Juliet as being imbued by how he thinks of the sun, right? That his day begins and ends with her, perhaps. She's the only, the most beautiful girl in Verona, that only in her nourishment can he grow. His declaration suggests that the moon, which other lovers use as an emblem of their love, is just reflected light and dead in comparison, or artificial in comparison. And then finally, we have the last one by Shakespeare. We have this, he brings into interaction here our ideas about bees, combs, and honey, and masons, singers, and gilded ceilings on the other hand. And so one of the crucial aspects of these particular types of metaphors is that it's not just resemblance, a sort of resemblance that's brought to our attention that we didn't see before, but reconstructing of the things that are in the comparison, and that sort of elevates what's being characterized. So resemblance doesn't seem to be the only thing that's involved in the metaphors, and their appreciation of them, or our understanding of them, asks us to orient ourselves to the world in a new way. At least this is the claim for Ricoeur, and we're going to try and understand that. And so one thing I think he means by this is, for instance, in the Singing Masons building roofs of gold, right, is that we don't just see insects, right, or something we can typically, that we see them in our, in our life world as something we can stamp out with a swatter, or this Cartesian world populated by automatons. What we're given here is sort of an inherent, we're supposed to understand this as a sort of inherent beauty and significance to the work of bees. We see them as singing masons, as masters of a particular craft with an aesthetic value beyond that of their instrumentality. And reading this, for instance, in 2021, opens up the sort of realm of green thoughts, or green sort of orientation that we have to the world that may or may not have been part of the active meaning of this metaphor when it was penned by Shakespeare and understood by the collective of people who would have been part of the audience of his plays or reading his sonnets, for instance. Okay, so much for living metaphors and the basic qualifications and terminology that we're going to be working with. Want to begin with, so what we've been saying about living metaphors is that they have this power of creating something that wasn't just there in the interaction of the in the subject terms themselves, but rather what we're seeing is that there is an interaction between the two subject terms, such that we get a new meaning that's produced in their interaction. And so Ricoeur is following along a tradition of people here, such as I. Richards, Max Black, and Monroe Beardsley, who all put forth some sort of interactionist account. And it's the interactionist account that tries to promote the idea of the creativity of metaphor as having some sort of new signification in the world, right? And so the paradox that I'm trying to understand is that on the interactionist understanding of metaphor, we see that a strong or living metaphor creates a meaning which in some way is objective or truthful, yet this meaning is new, which is to say that prior to the metaphor, the independent terms themselves, the things under comparison, neither suggested this new meaning nor signified the concepts which would support it. So if the meaning is new, what is it exactly that supplies this feeling of appropriateness? How do we get that based on interaction? Now, Ricoeur's answer to the question, which is something I'm going to try and unpack, is that living metaphor imaginatively reconfigures, and not in the pejorative sense of the term imaginary, but imaginatively reconfigures or redescribes reality in a new way. And we're going to see how the arc of understanding unfolds for Ricoeur, and then try and use Searle's, some of Searle's terminology and in social ontology to kind of understand what it is Ricoeur has in mind. Okay. So one of the most important things for Ricoeur is that we have to understand reference, so reference to the world as an act of poetic reconfiguration. So for Ricoeur, the analysis of metaphor, its most fundamental analysis, is this act of seeing something as something else, right? And it's the seeing as understood as a poetic reconfiguration of reality that transforms the subject's experience and the audience's experience of the metaphor, the auditor's experience of the metaphor, into a what he calls a being as. And I quote, "Does not the fittingness of metaphor indicate that language not only has organized reality in a different way, but also made manifest a way of being of things, which is brought to language thanks to semantic innovation? It would seem that the enigma of metaphorical discourse is that it invents in both senses of the word. What it creates, it discovers, and what it finds, it invents." And so that's the paradox, the question I was looking at in the last section. And just to reiterate, so my claims are, in a more detailed fashion, that we can understand Ricoeur's claim that the hermeneutic arc involved in living metaphor, the hermeneutic arc that takes us from seeing as to being as involved in living metaphor, opens us up to new features of our social world by thinking of them as a form, by thinking of metaphor, the living metaphor, as a form of poetic declaration. And this is why Searle's declarative, the logic of declarative is going to be important. The second claim is that we can change our social world in the relevant sense if we understand living metaphors as working in a way similar to the logic of declaratives. And so the declaratives we have in mind here are things like, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," or we get God's expression in Genesis, "Let there be light," for instance, in a form of declaratives. Now, the declarative has a double direction of fit, I'm sure we're aware, in the sense that we have a word-to-world and a world-to-word direction of fit. So what they institute, they create, and what they create, they've instituted. Finally, the declaration of a fresh metaphor moves us from seeing as to the being as such and such a way. And this being as itself is where I think we can locate being as in terms of Searle's social ontology is the subjective ontological level. So we're not populating the world with any more objects necessarily, but we are populating them with entities in some relevant sense. Okay. So understanding Ricoeur's hermeneutics and the arc of mimesis. So all understanding involves hermeneutics. This is Ricoeur's claim, and this means everything. So whenever we have to sort of reorganize our understanding of the world, we're always engaged in interpretation. Hermeneutics for him is just going to be one way to say interpretation. Now, the hermeneutics of metaphor is specifically going to involve three stages, which I've been calling the hermeneutic arc. We have stage one, or Mimesis one, which is prefiguration. Now, prefiguration is I want us to think about it as something akin to what Searle has in mind when he talks about the background. So this is our pre-understanding of the world of action. It's the symbolic resources we have access to and our practical orientations to it. Now, from that, we can pluck certain things and configure them in a certain way as to provide them with some sort of coherence. Now, this hermeneutic arc for Ricoeur is probably, or most notably, taken shape in time and narrative, but he also refers to this in the rule of metaphor, la métaphore. So the Mimesis 2, so stage 2 configuration, is perhaps the most crucial for metaphor, for living metaphor. And this is the way that we organize the various things, features, and properties that populate Mimesis 1, our prefigured world, and into something coherent that refigures it in a certain way. So here we see Ricoeur opening up the notion of mimesis from Aristotle, which was the sort of reproduction or imitation of reality. Here we don't want to think about it just as a reproduction or a copy, but as a poetic redescription. Mimesis 3 is refiguration. This is the ability to grasp what's been configured as reaching out what is beyond it. And what I think he means by that is this is the reception of the metaphor itself, for instance. So this is how either you read the metaphor to yourself or how somebody else is interpreting the metaphor, but this is where it takes its first outing and the collective can now is now forced to interpret it in some way. So we have these three stages of mimesis. Now in Mimesis 3, it has to be said that the hermeneutics is part of a circle for Ricoeur, that when we reach Mimesis 3, we've come around full circle effectively, because we've brought our understanding to the world in order to understand it, but we've also increased our understanding of it. So we've repopulated the prefigured world in some sense after the reception of the living metaphor is taken up by a particular speech community, for instance. Okay. So we do seem to be adding to the world in some sense, and we'll try and figure out, I'm going to try and figure out exactly what that means for Ricoeur. Now, we know that Searle's social ontology rests on the fact that it's symbolically mediated. It's mediated through language. And nevertheless, and even though that's the case, is that we still have this other aspect to reality. So Searle contrasts the social and natural objects that we have in reality, as well as the social and natural reality itself. Now, what's important is that the social realm is constituted out of our agreements, whereas the natural realm is something that can't be. So these are the brute facts. Nevertheless, we only have access to them through language. These things will exist independently of our mind. And that's what Searle says, at least, about that. Now, he gives us, so what's interesting for him is how we constitute facts in the social realm based on agreement. And he gives us a particular mnemonic for that. And this was a sort of peculiarity, a curiosity I had when reading through his social ontology, and its kinship with how we understand metaphor. Now, he says that X counts as Y in some context C. So with this, we can declare that something is the case. So he says that all social objects or social facts have this sort of logic inherent in them. Even if you don't outright declare something as being the case, you can still count something, so some X as Y in a particular context. And if the right amount of people all agree, or the right authority is uttering this, or is trying to fashion some social fact, it has this particular logic to it. So we have what this does basically is open up a special kind of deontology. What this means is that we have, when we declare something to be the case, this includes us treating it as the case, which comes with or is equipped with inherently the rights, responsibilities, the authorizations or obligations, permissions, and entailments that it's supposed to come with, for us treating it as that thing. So what we get from this is that the core of the social is anchored, so to speak, um, or enacted by individual agents who they're through shared assignments and agreements coordinate actions in concert with their social peers, and our actions within this function as an ongoing reproduction of the social institution, which according to Searle is nevertheless thematized and objectified as such, and as an object almost sui generis based on its inherent intentional constitution, right, which forms the basis of our social nexus, of our social reality. So intentional states define the core structure of the social. Now, he also gives us the notion of a background. This background provides us with information, both cultural and linguistic, in our shared sort of social world, as well as occupied with these sort of what he calls brute facts, or it includes things that are mind independent. So what he wants to do is, what he provides us with is a way for understanding how we can tease apart the sorts of things that are enmeshed within the background. So we get the epistemic subjective position. We have an ontological subjective, an epistemic objective, and ontological and objective things. When we're talking about, so epistemically speaking, subjective and objective are primarily predicates of judgment. Subjective judgment means that the truth or falsity of a claim is not settled objectively, because the truth or falsity is not a simple matter of fact, but really depends on attitudes or feelings. One of the examples he gives is Rembrandt is a better artist than Rubens. We can contrast these sorts of judgments with objective judgments, like Rembrandt lived in Amsterdam during the year 1632, which is another example he gives. So for objective judgments, the facts of the world that make them true or false are independent of anybody's attitudes or feelings about them. Or something like this is how he contrasts it. It's never extremely clear what he has in mind for each one, and sometimes it seems like one fact or one judgment can be in one place and another at the same time, or occupy multiple places within the matrix. But nevertheless, this is what he gives us. In the ontological sense of things, Searle tells us that terms objective and subjective are predicates of entities and types of entities, and they ascribe modes of existence to them. So in the ontological sense, pains are subjective entities. He says the institution of money would be one of those things, because their mode of existence depends on being felt by subjects. But things like mountains and rivers, in contrast to pains, are ontologically objective because their mode of existence is independent of any perceiver or any mental state. Now, Searle notes that the social world has a subjective ontology or mode of existence. So everything is found right here in our social ontology. Now, what I think how we want to understand Ricoeur's claim about how metaphor relates to ontology, or moving from the seeing as to the being as, is we need to place it at that part of Searle's four-part distinction, that when we have a particularly apt living metaphor that enraptures a literature department that we start using in our everyday, or we read a really good story or a beautiful poem, what it's doing is providing us with a way it's providing us with a particular mode of existence, to see existence in a certain way, to see reality in a certain way. That way being subjective, nevertheless being ontological in Searle's relevant sense. And I think this is the case because metaphors work like declarations. Now, I'm not entirely fond of calling all metaphors declarations, but I think the underlying logic, or at least the underlying reason behind Ricoeur's thoughts is that they have this sort of component to them, or there's a familiarity between what he thinks living metaphors do and how declaratives work in Searle's philosophy. And we can see that there is some striking similarities between the declaration and what Ricoeur wants the living metaphor to do, just by reading a little bit of Searle. So he's all institutional realities, both created in its initial existence and maintained in its continued existence by way of representations that have the same logical structure as declarations, even though in specific cases they may not actually be in the form of a declaration. So we don't have to actually say, I declare. The poet himself doesn't have to say, I declare, now that we view bees as singing masons, for instance. But rather in the act of metaphorization is what invites us to think about the world in this new way. It opens up a possibility to do so. So what's of interest is precisely those cases where we make something the case by representing it as being the case. When the poet asks us to see one thing as something else, he's taking the first step for us to get to recognize it as being something else, for us to get to treat it that way. And as I mentioned in, for example 3, for instance, about the Shakespeare's example of the bees as masons, right? We now have a new way to orient ourselves towards them, right? The poet seems to open up with the poem itself, or the metaphor, the living metaphor, seems to open up this sort of new experience. Now, Ricoeur understands this phenomenologically. What it's doing is it's opening up a phenomenological truth. As being is reached through a process of seeing as over the hermeneutic arc. Right, so seeing as is a notion Ricoeur borrows from Gestalt psychology, and it's not the same thing as just merely seeing, which he considers to be very passive. Merely seeing is an experience, right? It's something that happens to us, it seems. But seeing as is more of an action. It's both an experience and an action at the same time. So you either see something as something else or you don't, right? And it's like those in Gestalt psychology, you see those magic eye pictures, for instance, which ostensibly consist merely of these little bands of colored dots. But when you look at it a certain way, it reveals a picture. Now, you can't be taught to see these sorts of pictures. You either see it or you don't, and some people never do. And so this is what the poet's asking us to do. He's demanding us to go through this sort of hermeneutic arc. So what he does is he puts himself on paper as declaring something be the case, that he sees something as the case. He's asking us to sort of take the time to try and see it that way too. And in so doing, we kind of treat the thing as the case. We have really no choice but to, once we get the point of the metaphor. And so I think that the living metaphors have, as I was saying, a similar function as declaratives. We see that speakers are anchored to their background and then use this sort of constitutive rule to recreate or populate the social ontology. And this comes with particular entailments of treating the world as being a certain way. And interestingly enough, Searle says seeming to be F, so seeming to be the case, some term F is necessary for taking something to be that thing. And Ricoeur's terminology, of course, as we're now familiar with, is seeing as found being as. When, for instance, Romeo says that Juliet is the sun, he declares this to be the case, and therefore this comes with certain entitlements and entailments to treat her as such. And this is where I think Ricoeur Searle can help Ricoeur sort of flesh out his idea of the power of the living metaphor. Now, of course, why we place the living metaphor, what it aims to do at the level of subjective ontology, is that we're not populating the world with any more mind-independent objects. The features that are populating the world are going to be relative to the people who are perceiving them. So in this case, by listening to a metaphor, by reading a metaphor, for instance. And so we have a new way to redescribe reality, or a new mode in which we can see it and then therefore act towards it. Now, because I'm quite over time, I'm just going to finish up with some last minute brief concluding remarks. What I think happens is that in Ricoeur's philosophies, the movement of metaphorical meaning is then channeled into some validity-oriented interpretive process. We want to make sure that what we're saying is apt and that it does apply to something, within which meaning resources provided by the background, as Searle calls it, or Mimesis one, as Ricoeur is calling it, are intersubjectively warranted and then publicly adjudicated. Right, so this is where the terminology of Searle is going to come in to try and flesh out some of the things that Ricoeur is saying. This is because meaning and validity for Searle are intimately intertwined, and the same holds for Ricoeur. So I believe, and that's the understanding of utterances and actions is based on an however, an implicit grasp of the reasons and their justifications. So the claims, although they lack reference external to our collective like living metaphors make claims that lack reference external to our collective understanding. This is not to say or provide some sort of dismissive view of the unreality of the social, but it's an appreciation of its nature and consequences as something real. And with that, I'm going to conclude. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation.